This scientist discovered a demon and raised it as his own son. One problem, he's destined to end the world. Count me in. The screen is blank and then we start descending into Earth with this man who was a paranormal advisor to President Roosevelt, telling us some stuff about himself. He says it all started in 1944 when he was 28 and was on a classified mission off the coast of Scotland. The Germans desperately wanted to upset the balance of war, so they combined science and black magic. Then something happened one night which affected the course of history and changed his life forever. Voiceover is now over, and now we see soldiers running into a tunnel while it rains. The day is the 9th of October, 1944. We see a man, Professor Broom, hand a rosary to one of the soldiers, Sergeant Whitman, who is just at the foot of a life-size cross of Jesus. He says his men will need it. Whitman doesn't accept the rosary. Instead, he offers the professor a rifle. He doesn't accept it. He says he abhors the use of violence. Then the sergeant leaves him there and goes to meet his men. The professor turns to Jesus and seems to mutter a prayer before joining the troop. They crawl up to some place and they see a building which has this sussy sign on it, and soldiers are swarming around. Then they see a man with a gas mask on. His name is Karl Ruprecht Cronin, I think, and he's Hitler's top assassin. Broom says if Karl is here, then this is worse than he thought. Then we see a bald man, Grigori, telling a woman, Ilsa, that no matter what happens tonight, this book will guide her back to him. Then he puts a finger on her head and says that he's granting her everlasting life, youth, and the power to serve him. While they're there, General Klaus von Krupp calls out to them and tells them it's time. Talking to Grigori, the general refers to 5 years of research and construction, and he reminds them that their boss doesn't look kindly on failure. Grigori assures him there will be no failure. He promised the man in charge a miracle, and he'll deliver one. Now Karl is attaching some machine to Grigori's hand while he delivers a speech. He says what he'll do tonight will never be undone, and their enemies will be destroyed. He says some incantations, then some sparks start flying from the attached hand and a portal opens. A lamp is sucked into the portal and it flies into space. Meanwhile, Whitman and his men are watching from behind a rock, and some silly guy tries to take pictures before he's dragged down. It's crazy that people have been doing things for the gram since before the war. One of the Germans notices them and starts walking towards them, but they throw 2 bombs and he's blown away towards the portal. Then a shootout ensues. Karl is having a good time clapping Whitman's men. Now he's going for Broom, who's on the floor, but one of the soldiers starts shooting at Karl. It does nothing to him though, because he has on a protective bodysuit, but then a bomb explodes and it slams him to the wall, and a rod is sent into his chest, and he dies. Due to death, or so it seems. Finally, Grigori is sucked into the portal just before it closes, but Ilsa manages to run away with her book. Whitman thinks it's all over, but the professor is suspicious. He suspects that something must have come through from the portal because it was open for too long. So he asks Whitman to instruct his men to search the area thoroughly. As they're trying to help the injured Broom to somewhere safe, they notice that Karl's body has disappeared. The rod is still there, but the man no longer is. Now we see Broom sitting down and nursing his wounds when a soldier comes and asks him if he really believes in hell. Broom says there's a dark place where an ancient evil slumbers and waits to return. He says Grigori only gave them a glance. Then he tells them a bit about Grigori. He says he was poisoned, shot, stabbed, clubbed, castrated, and drowned in 1916, but somehow they still saw him tonight. Then they hear a sound and Broom gets up and limps towards where the sound came from. A small creature pops out and the soldier immediately starts shooting at it. He thinks it's an ape. Broom says it's not. The rest of the pack show up after hearing the gunshots and they're all ready to shoot at the thing, but Broom stops them. He offers the creature some chocolate and it grabs it with its really huge hand. It appears Broom was right after all. Something did come through from the portal. The professor then asks for a blanket and manages to convince the thing to jump down and get into the blanket. They now see that he's a harmless little thing, so they all warm up to him. They start taking care of him together and even name him. Naturally, he's named Hellboy. It certainly matches the appearance. They all take a picture with him, and wait a minute, the movie is just starting. Oh wow, we're in for a long ride. Now we're in Moldavia and it's the present day. We see some men walking up an icy mountain being led by a woman holding a book. They find an inscription on a rock and then break through ice and keep walking until they get to a place which they say is sacred. The man in front asks for his gold. A bar of gold with a sign on it is tossed to him, and he's stabbed from behind. His blood runs through the channels on the ground and boom, some guy appears from underneath. It's Grigori. Remember he told Ilsa that the book would lead her back to him? Ilsa calls him master and asks what they have done to his eyes. Get you a girl who calls you master. Now we cut to the Lexington Oncology Center in New York, where some doctors are in a lab. A gray-haired man is dressing up, and they're telling him he has a malignant sarcoma in his lungs, spine, liver, and basically he has approximately 6 weeks to live. They offer him pain management, but he says he'd rather be at home. He has some arrangements to make for his son. This old man has a rosary around his hand, by the way, so that alone tells you he's Professor Broom. The doctors tell him he can get a second opinion, but he says that won't be necessary, and he leaves. Outside Inside the hospital, he comes across a TV where Tom Manning, the head of operations at the FBI, is on a TV show talking about a sighting of Hellboy. Manning is actually there to disprove the existence of any such thing. He looks at the camera and sends a clear message to the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense, or BPRD, and says that there is no such thing. Now we head to the BPRK office in Newark. A man named John Mayers arrives on a bike and he says he has just been transferred from Quantico. Then some machine thing pops out and nearly blinds him, all in the name of scanning his eye. He's eventually let in, and before he can even introduce himself to the guy there, the man tells him he's late. Before he knows it, the ground opens and he descends to section 51. He enters a room where there's an alien-looking thing in a glass asking him to turn the pages of a book. Then Professor Broom pops out and introduces himself. John tries to introduce himself, but the alien just cuts him off and does that for him instead, telling him all about himself. John, of course, is shocked. He's about to ask how it knew all that, but Broom cuts him off and tells him to refer to the alien guy as he, not it. Those are his preferred pronouns. This movie was ahead of its time. Broom goes on to tell John about this alien guy whose name is Abraham Sapien. He was born the day Abraham Lincoln died, and that's how he got his name. Weird flex, but okay. John asks how Abe knows so much about him, and Broom just tells him that Abe possesses a unique frontal lobe. He now gives John a little history talk as he takes him to meet a man in a suit named Clay. Broom then hands him 2 bars of chocolates and turns around to leave. John is shocked that he's not coming with him. Broom tells him that he handpicked him from 70 Academy graduates, so we better make him proud. Clay then opens a metal door and takes him into a room where he meets Hellboy. John is starstruck. He has read a lot about Hellboy in comics. Clay tells Hellboy that John is his new liaison, and Hellboy says he doesn't want him. Clay tells John to offer the chocolates and he does, so Hellboy starts to come around. Clay also tells him not to stare at his horns because he doesn't like that, but he can't stop himself. As he's still staring, an alarm goes off, and Hellboy says, "Let's go fight some monsters." And that's exactly what I came here for. We quickly cut to the library where the alarm was triggered. The place is crowded. Reporters, bystanders, everyone is here. Then Hellboy and Abe arrive in a garbage truck. They get in and meet Broom. They open a box and Hellboy is checking out some weapons while Abe is running his hands through a door. He says behind the door is some dark entity who's evil, ancient, and hungry. So Hellboy says he'll go in and say hi. He goes in and asks for the door to be shut behind him. An alpha male like this needs no backup. John is surprised that he went in alone, and Abe just says he likes it that way. Inside, Hellboy sees the creature and the mess it has made. And just as Abe is telling him about the creature, it falls to the floor and runs away. Hellboy shoots at it as it runs, and it falls to the floor. He thinks the job is done and he's walking through the door, but Abe tells him the creature is also known as the Hound of Resurrection. Hellboy turns, and the body is no longer where it was. He asks Abe how then he's going to clamp this thing permanently, and Abe doesn't know. So Hellboy turns back to try and complete the job, but just as he turns, the creature shows up and throws him through the door. It starts throwing him around. He's really showing Hellboy, hell. This creature then throws him through some glasses and all the way downstairs where he sees Grigori, who tells him he alone knows his true calling and true name. But Hellboy isn't interested. He picks up his pistol to shoot, but as he lifts his head, he doesn't see Grigori anymore. He now turns around to the creature, which grabs his hand with one of its limbs, but John shows up in time to help him. He shoots the creature multiple times, and it's writhing around on the floor now, but Hellboy isn't grateful for the help. He says, "What do you think you're doing? Nobody helps me. Big man, you might have to be a little humble here. That thing almost clapped you, and not in the fun way." Anyway, they go and hide behind a wall, and John helps Hellboy load his gun, but the creature pops out yet again. He shoots the creature and it starts running away. Hellboy chases him, and John is coming from behind trying to stop Hellboy, because they're headed towards civilians. But Big Red doesn't stop. He's determined to stop this creature. John, by the way, nearly gets hit by a car as he's trying to catch up, but Hellboy stops the car, saying, "Red means stop." I like that one. He continues his chase of the creature and follows it into a rail track. The thing enters the train where there are civilians and Hellboy follows, but he's barely hanging on while the creature has passed through the train and made it out on the other side. He's thrown off the train by a warden and he's left on the tracks. Guess you can say he was stopped in his tracks. The creature drops down and their fight continues, but Hellboy finally puts his big hand on the track and the creature's electrocuted, pretty much fried. He then says, "I'm fireproof, you're not," as he lights his cigar and talks to John. He tells him to tell his dad, Professor Broom, that he'll be home but he shouldn't wait up. John insists that he has to go with him, but Hellboy just tells him goodbye. Wait a minute, is the creature resurrecting again? Because what are those things coming out of his body? Anyway, we'll see those things in a minute here in this locker room of an abandoned subway area, where Ilsa just finished shaving Grigori's head and hands him a fresh pair of eyes. Yes, there they are. Grigori says the creature just fulfilled its destiny, die in peace and be reborn again and again. Then Ilsa says it's just 7 more days until the eclipse. The things from the creature disappear in Grigori's hand, and we now see 2 more of the disgusting creatures rising up. Back to Hellboy. He nicks a pack of beer and heads to a psychiatric hospital minimum security unit to see a girl. Oh, even Hellboy has a girlfriend, but I don't? Isn't that just fantastic? The girl, Liz, comes out to see him, and he says he just wanted to see her. Now, Tom, you remember, right? FBI head of operations, pulls up in a limo to see Broom at the library. Abe feels a sword and says they were here. So Broom goes and puts his hand on Abe's hand and asks him to show him what happened. He can now see the entire thing play out. Carl climbs down and then Ilsa shows up and smashes the glass. Carl then slashes smashes the statue with his sword just as cops gather and start shooting at him. He ricochets the bullets back to the first two men who were shooting from up. The remaining cops downstairs start shooting at Carl, but of course, the bullets don't penetrate. Instead, he claps all of them one after the other. Grigori now shows up, and Ilsa empties the contents of the container she took from the statue on the floor. He then breathes something out of his mouth and puts it on the grains on the floor. Then he says, "For each one of you that falls, two shall rise." As the things stand up to form that disgusting creature, Broom has seen enough, but now he's weak. Abe can tell that he's really sick, but Broom says he doesn't want Hellboy to know. Then he tells Abe that 60 years ago, Grigori and his crew tried to destroy the world, and now they're back in his lifetime to finish the job. All this is happening while Hellboy is still with his sweetheart begging her to come back. Sam. She says no, not this time. She doesn't like it here, but at least she hasn't had an episode in months. Also, she says she's learning to control her powers and where it comes from. She says for the first time in her life, she's not afraid. Just then, John, Broom, Clay, and a few other guys pull up at the psych hospital to take Hellboy home. Liz then stands up to leave. She tells Hellboy, she calls him HB by the way. How sweet. Anyway, she tells Hellboy she has a chance out here, and if he really cares about her, he won't come back. Then she leaves. Just then, John approaches Hellboy and tells him it's time to go home. Just then, he falls. Apparently, he has lost a lot of blood. As they take Hellboy away, Liz and John stare at each other for a bit, but say nothing. Broom observes that though. Back at home, Abe is operating on Hellboy, and he says he was burned by some organic acid. Then Broom starts telling Hellboy he worries about him, and tells him he won't be around forever. Then Abe finds out that this little creature which latched onto Hellboy's skin laid 3 eggs in him. Abe puts the eggs under a microscope and starts telling them about the eggs. He says they're sensitive to heat and light. They need a humid, dark environment to breed. So Broom says they'll have to head back to the train tracks tomorrow with some agents to search the whole place, to find the eggs and destroy them. Now we see John doing some research on Liz. She has pyrokinesis. Just about that time, we see Grigori in Liz's room. He tells her to dream of fire and then kisses her forehead, and something lights up there. Now she's dreaming of when she was younger and was being chased by some bullies in school, and she used her superpowers to set fire everywhere. No chill. The fire then transcends the dream world and actually burns down the entire hospital. Then we see Hellboy asking Broom, how many buildings does she have to burn down? She belongs here. But the professor says, that's not what she feels. She may never feel it. Her choice. Her body, her choice. Wow, this movie really was progressive. Now John says he thinks he can bring Liz back after reading her file. He just needs to talk to her. Hellboy doesn't seem to buy the idea very much, so he sort of roasts John. That's enough to put John off. Next thing we see is John telling Broom that he's not his guy. Hellboy doesn't respect him and doesn't want him around. So Broom just tells him he's dying, and he worries about Hellboy just like any father would about his son. He tells John that all he asks is for him to have the courage to stand by Hellboy after he dies. He tells John that Hellboy's born a demon and nobody can change that, but his job is to help him become a man. Surely that's enough convincing, but John still goes to see Liz. He's first briefed and asks if he's sure he wants to go in and see her. Of course he does. He goes in, introduces himself, and goes straight to the point. He tells her that Broom asked him to invite her back to the bureau. She says she has quit the borough 13 times, but she always goes back. Where else would she go? That's a pretty clear yes. Now we see Hellboy, Abe, and some agents at some abandoned subway area. Abe can feel a pulse at the other side, so they go over. There's no door, so Hellboy just starts breaking the wall. While the agents are talking about getting a request for a permit, the loud bangs alert Carl. Hellboy now takes off the lid to some underground water place, which Abe dives into. There's a creature there, and Abe notices it just as he's picking the eggs. Then boom, Hellboy sees Carl and immediately starts chasing him. Of course the agents follow, but Carl loses all of them. It's his hood anyway. Meanwhile, in the water, that creature attacks Abe just as he drops the little thing Hellboy gave him. The creature's really beating Abe's ass, man, but he manages to hide. Back up, the agents see 2 creatures just hovering around the hole. One agent tries to shoot, but the creature just grabs him by the face. Before he can even get a bullet out, the other agent immediately runs away but is chased down and pounced on by the other creature. The last agent standing, Clay, is now communicating with Hellboy and asking where he is just as Hellboy once again comes face to face with this creature he once clapped. The brawl is crazy now, and they both land by the train track where civilians are. The fight seems very evenly matched, but the creature takes a huge lead when some part of the building collapses on Hellboy. But Hellboy stands up looking more menacing, even though he doesn't do much. The creature literally just flings him away. Hellboy gets up again, and this time does a better job of beating the creature. A moving train comes and finishes up the job for him. He even saves a woman's kittens in the process. But by now, we already know the drill. Once one dies, 2 more resurrect, and we see that happen in real time just as Abe comes out of the water. Carl now shows up where Clay is. Clay shoots Carl and then Carl stabs him. He does that and then lays down beside Clay and turns a button on his chest. Wait, is he dead? Anyway, Hellboy shows up and tries to send a message to the rest of the agents that Clay is down, but they're all dead. No one can read you, HB. But while Hellboy is going through his sad moment, his love interest is enjoying the air of freedom in her face as she's in the cab going back to the bureau with John. She's taking pictures, but John tells her it's not safe to be putting her head head outside the car like that and tells her to come down. Does she listen? Of course not. But if you can't beat them, join them, right? So John joins her to poke his head outside the window, and he lets the picture she took of him fly away. Back at the bureau, Abe is now back in his pod, and Tom starts going in on Hellboy. He tells him he's reckless, and finally says that after he's done clapping every monster out there'll still be one left. Him. So Hellboy just picks up some metal thing and acts like he's going to throw it at Tom, but just puts it through the glass instead. He might be a demon, but he has a conscience. Tom starts yelling that he wants Hellboy locked up. Meanwhile, Liz and John have made their way inside the building, and are now exchanging pleasantries with Broom. Hellboy sees Liz, and you can see how that immediately warms his heart, but everyone quickly departs from him. John now goes to check up on Liz in her room, and they seem to be getting along. Perhaps too well. I don't think Hellboy will like that. Well, speak of the devil. All possible pun intended. We see Hellboy on his bed preparing something he wants to say to Liz, and as if on cue, she comes in. But as Hellboy tells her she has something to tell her, she says she's about to go out for a cup of coffee with John. Hellboy doesn't like the sound of that, and you can see it in how he's now acting towards John. Anyway, let's take a break from this love triangle and go back to Professor Broom, who is currently recording himself while he examines Carl's body. Oh, Carl is really dead? Broom looks up and asks, what horrible will could keep such a creature as this alive? Meanwhile, Hellboy has escaped from his room. He's following Liz and John. He's a really jealous lover, I see. What he doesn't know is that John is playing wingman for him. He's telling Liz that Hellboy loves her, and Liz says she doesn't know what she feels, but what she knows is that she thinks about HB every day. John and Liz keep walking and Hellboy keeps following, and he sees Liz take John's picture, and he starts pacing up and down like a high school boy. He tries to fly down and confront them, but he doesn't succeed, so he climbs back up, where he sees a little boy who recognizes him as Hellboy. He tells the little boy not to tell anyone, but I doubt this boy will be staying quiet. Meanwhile, back at the bureau, Broom is informed that Hellboy escaped, and he just says that Hellboy will never change and goes back to his research. And now, we see Carl wake up and get dressed. I just knew he couldn't be dead. Hellboy is still stalking John and Liz. In fact, he has gotten a little too comfortable. He's eating cookies with milk with his new friend while he watches on. He sees John put his arm around his girl, and that's when he loses it. He picks a stone and throws it at John's head, but of course, John can't tell where it came from. Broom is still doing his research just as Carl descends from the stairs. And guess who he finds sitting in his room? Grigori. He says something about using Hellboy to destroy the world after Broom is dead, and he puts his finger on Broom's forehead and shows him a vision of Hellboy bringing about the end of the world. Grigori says he knows Hellboy's real name and asks Broom if he wants to know what it is, but the professor says it doesn't matter. What matters is what he calls Hellboy, which is son. How sweet. He now heads to his table, puts his rosary down, and says, I'm ready. So Carl drives his sword into Broom and he falls. Now just take a look at Hellboy. They just clapped your dad, but here you are stalking a girl you like a little boy. Perhaps worse than a little boy, because the actual little boy in this situation is telling him to just go and tell the lady how he feels. But just as this kid is offering his 2 cents, some agents pull up to Liz and John in a car, and Hellboy can just tell that something is wrong. He immediately heads home, and now we see him kneeling over his father's body. Next, it's the funeral. And this is just by the way, but Hollywood, where is it written that it must always rain during funerals? Anyway, we see Hellboy standing away from everybody else clutching Broom's rosary. Then back at the bureau, Liz is asking Abe if she should stay with Hellboy because he hasn't eaten, slept, or talked to anyone in 3 days. Abe tells her to go take care of him. Now we cut to a military base in Moscow. Grigori, Ilsa, and a general arrive in a limo. The soldiers open a vault to reveal some rock. Remember that thing Ilsa saw at the icy mountain? Yes, that's it. Grigori says he wanted it for ages, so Ilsa offers the general a box of gold bars for it. John and a few other agents are now being briefed by Tom about an operation. They'll be headed to Moscow soon. He sees Liz walk by and immediately goes out, but he doesn't stop her. She goes to meet Hellboy, and she tells him she'll come to Moscow if he's still going. He says he is. He then tells her he has something to say. He says he knows that what he is makes her feel like she's a little out of place, unlike John, who makes her feel like she belongs. He says he wishes he could do something about his appearance. Same, but he promises her he'll never give up on her, ever. She loves that. Now we see Hellboy and the rest of the gang arriving at Moscow for the big show. It's snowing like hell, and they're walking through a cemetery. They're now confused on where to go, so Hellboy finds a dead boy, dangles some jewelry over its face, and it comes to life, and gives him the direction he needs. He even carries the dead, more like undead, guy along with him. They walk into a room and Hellboy says they'll be alright as long as they don't separate. And as if on cue, some gates just spring up from the ground and separate them into 2 groups. They're communicating, but they have to go different ways. Hellboy's with Tom and an agent, and Tom is trying to stamp his authority. They hear some sounds and Hellboy says something is coming for them, and they have to confront it, but Tom insists they go back. But just as he's yelling, the agent and Hellboy's new undead friend are thrown down the abyss. Hellboy grabs Tom and slides him through a gate that's just about to close. Then he runs and makes it through the gate himself, just before the gate closes, and the ground he just ran on completely collapses. They hear music, so Hellboy traces it and it leads them to Carl. Carl shows up and starts swinging his swords. He first lasses Tom, so Hellboy steps in to defend him. The fight at first seems evenly matched until Carl gets Hellboy on the face. So Hellboy switches up and starts landing several punches on Carl. He says, "You clapped my father. Your ass is mine." That's a little sussy. Then he pushes him. Carl crashes against the glass, but he soon starts laughing. Before Hellboy could finish asking him why he's laughing, the ground under him had opened up, and all sorts of sharp swords and knives had sprung up. It nearly swallows them, but Hellboy manages to hold onto a rope, and Tom manages to climb out. Carl is ready to slash the rope, but Tom starts throwing stuff at him to get him to stop, and that proves to be enough, cause with Carl distracted for a second, Hellboy is able to wrap the rope around his neck and pull him down the knives and swords. He then throws a heavy metal on him for good effect. After a job well done, he tries to light a cigar with a lighter, but Tom tells him, never light a cigar that way. You use a wooden match. It preserves the flavor. Okay, Hellboy now goes to look for Liz and John, and he can hear them below him talking about him, so he puts his ear to the ground to hear more. But Liz and John and the agent make their way into a den of these creatures, and Liz immediately calls Hellboy for help. He's breaking the ground to get through to them, while the agent is taking a sweet time to set up his weapon. But these creatures don't have that patience, so they immediately jump him. Hellboy shows up and starts fighting. He's clapping many of these creatures, but he can't really win because his one goes down. Two new ones spring up right there. Liz decides to intervene. She tells John to hit her. He first hesitates, but he eventually does. And boom, flames in her hands. He tells John to run. He immediately does. The flames are all around her now, and she sends it towards the creature. It fries them all, including the eggs. But remember, Hellboy is fireproof, so he's good. And that's why they make a good couple. Now we see John wake up right in front of Ilsa and Grigori. They put him and Hellboy in chains. Grigori and Ilsa are telling Hellboy that he is the key, and his hand is the hand of doom. They tell him to open the locks, but John tells him not to. He gets one to the face for his troubles. They're telling him to open the door or they take Liz's soul. Grigori tells him her soul awaits on the other side. If you want her back, open the door and claim her. Hellboy is trying to break out of his locks, but Grigori tells him that his true name is around the locks and he cannot break them no matter how strong he is. Then Ilsa says the eclipse has begun. Grigori grabs Broom's rosary from Hellboy, throws it to the ground, tells him to repeat a name which is his real name, and Hellboy does. He says he's doing it for Liz. Then the locks fall and his horns grow bigger. He walks towards the rock, inserts his hand into it, and it shoots some fire-like thing to the moon. Up there in the sky, some insane creatures are forming. While that is happening, John slips out of his lock and grabs hold of the rosary. He holds it up and shouts to Hellboy, "Remember who you are," just as Grigori tells him to open the final lock. Hellboy hesitates and turns back on hearing that. Then John tosses him the rosary. He grabs it but can't hold onto it. The cross burned deep into his flesh. John puts Ilsa on the ground and steps up to Hellboy and tells him, "You have a choice. Your father gave you that." Grigori yells, "No you don't. Open it." What does Hellboy do? He breaks the horns on his head, and the creatures in the sky quickly disappear, and the moon returns to its normal color. Grigori asks, "What have you done?" Hellboy says, "I chose," as he stabs him with his horn. Another my body, my choice moment. While Grigori is writhing in pain, he tells Hellboy that he'll never fulfill his destiny, and will never understand the power inside him. Hellboy goes to carry Liz's body, and says he'll just have to find a way to live with it. As he's walking away, he steps on Grigori's eye, and Grigori says, "Child, look what you've done. You've killed me, an insignificant man, but you have brought forth a god." Then some octopus-looking creature emerges from him, and grows insanely bigger before their eyes. Ilsa goes to Chris Grigori, and the creature claps them both. Hellboy takes Liz to some place and tells John to look over her. John tosses him the grenade belt, and asks him if he'll be okay alone. Hellboy says, "How big can it be?" And just as if on cue, this Leviathan grabs Hellboy and tosses him around. Hellboy's like a little kid in this monster's presence, but trust Hellboy, he's holding his own pretty well. I mean, he's still being tossed around, but he manages to grab the grenade belt and pull the cord, just as John asks him to right before the monster swallows him. So while he's in the monster's belly, it explodes and he's thrown out. Job well done. He goes back to John, and he tells her Liz has no pulse and is no longer breathing. He leans towards her, whispers some words to her, and she wakes up. They embrace and sparks start flying. No, I mean actual sparks, like literal flames. John watches on and basically says what makes a man is the choice he makes. Not how he starts things, but how he decides to end them. You know what? I think that's the moral of the story.